Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Centre for Health Services Studies annual lecture. I'm particularly pleased this year to welcome Professor Trish Greenhow. So thank you very much, Trish, for coming along. Professor Greenhow is probably well known to many of you, a long, and I can actually say a very distinguished career, both as a researcher but also in the media, the Bristol Medical Journal many years ago. I remember reading your articles and putting me on the right
that
track.
Old.
And has published very widely, over 200 publications in academic journals. So I'm very pleased that Trish was able to come along. Primary care is an area that the centre has been trying to develop a lot more over the past couple of years. And in some ways, I think, therefore, it's also very poignant because another very strong element of our work is involving patients and the public as well. And in effect, I think your talk kind of speaks very nicely to both those elements of the work that we do here in the centre. Trish is now Professor at the University of Oxford. And I think, from my point of view in particular, and I think from the Centre for Health Services Studies, where we cross the social sciences and kind of clinical divide, to have somebody who, in a sense, embodies that in all of her work, in terms of thinking about how you use social sciences to understand much about the medical world. I suppose in many ways, as a social scientist, I would say, well, of course, you can't understand the medical world without social science. So I think it's particularly important. Trish is very good at acronyms as well, I've noticed in the projects that you do with things like VOCAL and Ramesses, and so something we can perhaps learn as well. But the study she's going to talk about and talk about this evening, which is the remote videoing of consultations. And I know that Trish's work on consultations goes and the idea of storytelling as well within consultations in medicine, and particularly with groups who you wouldn't normally think about how they engage with the medical profession, has been really important and also very, very interesting. So I think we are set here for a very interesting talk. Trish is going to go through, she's got a few video sections, which we think now we've got the sound sorted out. But once Trisha's got through her, I will open up the floor to questions, and hopefully you'll be bombarded with some interesting questions. But can I first now welcome Professor Tricia Greenhow to give our lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. It's absolutely brilliant to be back here at the University of Kent. I haven't been here for 42 years, but at the age of 15, hope I've got the sums right there, it was the first university I ever set foot in. And I came on a big bus with a lot of other giggling 15-year-olds. And it was the first lecture of a year of the British Association of Young Scientists. And I remember going in, and the lecture theatre was one of those racked ones. I'd never seen a racked lecture theatre before. And at the end, when you asked questions, instead of being told to shut up or stand in the corner, the lecturer was quite pleased to hear the question. And I thought, this is the most wonderful thing, and I'm going to apply to university. So that, Kent was where I got inspired by a lecturer. So I hope maybe someone will be inspired today. Can I just ask, before we start, how many of you are academics at the Centre for Health Sciences? Health Services Studies. Or anywhere. How many of you are academics? Yeah, quite a few of you. And how many of you are would you describe yourselves as a jobbing clinician or a jobbing doctor, jobbing nurse, whatever? Fair few. And how many of you would describe yourself as wearing a patient hat? Great, brilliant, fantastic. I'm wearing one too. I've only just come out of hospital, actually, so I'm feeling very much on the side of the patient. Does anyone think they're in the wrong room? They haven't put their hand up yet. Any policy makers? Oh, yeah, okay, there's 1, 2 policymakers. Brilliant, fantastic. Hopefully we should have a great discussion, because I can't believe you've all got the same view of the universe. Now, before I start, thank you very much for inviting me. I love coming and giving lectures. I'm not too keen on the M25, but I really like coming and having a good discussion with a mixed audience. I'd like to thank the National Institute for Health Research and the Wellcome Trust for funding my research, and I'll tell you later which bit of each of them funded which bit of my research. Thanks to my research team, which now extends to, I don't know, about 18 people, but in particular the 3 people named here, because they've done an awful lot of the legwork for this piece of work, but they're not the only ones. I just didn't want to make the font size too small. And thanks also to participating NHS centres, GP surgeries, hospitals, etc., community clinics, and most especially to the patients whose consultations I hope you will see a clip of today. And I want to just explain the consent. We went through ethics approval, of course, NHS Rec. We invite the patients to, would you like, is it okay to record the consultation? And we give them the right amount of weeks to think about it. Some patients don't like being recorded in their homes. They don't mind the clinic end being recorded, but they'd rather we didn't go round to their house. So with some of them, we're not getting both ends. And we offer the option of them being pixelated, even when we're showing them to other members of the research team. The 2 patients whose videos you're going to see today are absolutely happy for you to view their consultations, and they've specifically asked not to be pixelated out. They prefer not to be. The people who are recording this lecture for posterity have been asked to remove those consultations from the online lecture when it goes online. So the only thing that the people viewing the lecture online will see is your reaction to those video consultations. So hopefully it'll work, but it's actually particularly important when you ask a question or make a comment to say, describe what you saw. Do you see what I mean? Because someone from, maybe another country might be viewing this talk and then they won't see it. So it's kind of like a game, really. Okay. I thought we might start with some data. I was going to put the video consultations in fairly late after I'd told you all about it, but I thought maybe let's just go in with a bit of a trailer. So I'm going to tell you where it came from later, but let me just describe what we've got here. We've got one consultation between a doctor, who's in the top left, my colleague Philippa Hanson from Newham General Hospital. She's a diabetes consultant, and the patient, whose name I don't know, even if I did know I wouldn't tell you it, who is a lady with gestational diabetes. So she didn't have diabetes before she got pregnant. Now she's got a bit of diabetes in pregnancy, which has to be managed very, very carefully to make sure the baby does okay. We have 2, what you're seeing on the left side is, I'm not sure whether it's left or right, I'll examine 2 of those. We've got 2 video cameras in the patient's house and 2 in the clinic, and they're each filming a different bit. And those of you who understand the term conversation analysis will know that we're going to make a really detailed analysis of the talk and the body language, which involves an awful lot of transcribing. So that's why you're seeing 4 different angles, because if someone scratches their ear or something, we see that as research data. Let's play it. It's a couple of minutes long. Anyone got any comments on that consultation?
The patient is writing, which doesn't happen very often during ordinary consultations. But they've got their own stuff there.
Yes. The patient is writing. Yes, the patient is actually doing quite a lot of work in that consultation, isn't she? Yes. She's very well organised, isn't she? Actually, she had everything there ready before she was. In fact, the doctor Skyped the patient in this. What else? Yeah.
From the patient perspective, I would have thought that it would be a good idea if the patient would send that data to the doctor before the consultation.
The patient might have sent the data to the doctor before the consultation. Yes, because there was a very laborious writing down of what was it and confirming the numbers, and actually that could have been sent by an email Or, in fact, as Philip has said, by Skype message. And they've been running this Skype clinic now for about 4 years, I think, at Newham. And this is a new-ish patient, but they do send data by Skype message. There's a problem with that, and that someone has to then transpose it and put it into the patient record. It doesn't go in automatically, which is a shame. Yeah. I'm sorry, this guy back, and then I'll have you again.
It'd be interesting to see how she did face-to-face consultations, but it felt like a very medically driven consultation, which just...
It was very medically driven. Yes, there wasn't a lot of what I would call socio-emotional talk, and this is one of the things that we are going to be analysing, is the Skype consultations appear to be shorter. They appear to get right down to business very, very quickly, and they talk about just the kind of things. I mean, this is why we picked this one, apart from the fact the patient kindly agreed, but actually out of those who agreed, this does illustrate. There's a lot of work being done. There's not a lot of, how are you? Have you been on holiday recently? That kind of thing. Sorry, you were going to ask a question.
Just a comment really that the conversation didn't flow smoothly.
The conversation didn't flow as smoothly.
They kind of almost spoke at the same time, conference time. It's difficult to
Yes.
you and the form.
Yes, there was a number of those things, and the conversation analysts among you will note that there was a lot of breakdowns and a lot of repairs in, that's the way they say, you can't quite hear them. I've got one of my sons is a marine biologist in Africa. We had a Skype conversation this morning, and the line was terrible. And we kept doing that. We kept interrupting each other, and we're quite used to it now because the power's always pretty bad where he is. But actually, when you're having an intimate, personal consultation, that awkwardness, the technical awkwardness, leads you to interrupt each other more. We know that. The question is, to what extent does it matter? And that's the kind of, given that this lady, if she didn't have that Skype consultation, she'd have to get 3 buses to get to the clinic. What we're talking about is the trade-off. But also, is there anything that can be done either technically or in terms of training, in terms of protocols that can reduce those overlaps of speech? We've also demonstrated that if you have a doctor and a nurse in the same room, or at the patient's house, if you have the patient and a relative in the same room, the co-located people don't interrupt each other, but they all interrupt as you're going across the divide, which of course is a technology thing. But those of you I find FaceTime, and I'm not being paid by any of these manufacturers, I find FaceTime just a little bit more technically slick. And I think my hypothesis is that those interruptions are less on FaceTime, not because it's FaceTime, but because it's technically, maybe it's higher bandwidth, I don't know what the technical term is. So those are the sorts of things that we're looking at. Okay. I'm going to show you another clip later, but let's just put this on here. Getting good at this. Okay. Expectations. That was one of the words in my title. You all know this. There is a massive expectation that technology-supported consultations are going to kind of take us into a wonderful utopian future for healthcare. It's going to be safer, it's going to be better, it's going to be more sustainable. The Prime Minister's Challenge Fund, which many of you will have heard of, if you haven't, it's a pot of money that was put aside for trying to get new ways of working in general practice. And there are lots and lots of pilots. I think there's about 14 up and down the country of doing Skype consultations in general practice. Now that's extraordinary, because when I first applied for this money for the study that we're doing at the moment, I applied in 2009 and I was shortlisted, and then I was turned down at the final funding decision because the panel felt that this would never happen, that Skype consultations, video consultations would never happen, therefore you can't have the money to do the research. Had they allowed us to do this research back in 2009, we would now have the results to inform policy. As it happens, policy jumped over. We just put in the same application 3 years later, saying, look, come on, you told us it isn't going to happen. Well, it is now policy. Could we please now have the money to do this work? Unfortunately, we'd already been getting going with a wing and a prayer at Newham, so we were ready to roll. This was only a couple of weeks ago. I don't know if you saw this in the Daily Telegraph. I saw it on Twitter. The NHS now, in order to soak up the workforce shortage in general practice, is now hiring private companies. I think one of them is Babylon and one of them is Push Doctor, to take Skype calls from patients of NHS doctors who can't get an appointment. Well, that's all very interesting. Here's another one. This is Push Doctor, and this is Guardian about 3 days ago. The doctor will see you now on your smartphone. So the implication is that, well, you just get your phone out and hit the what's it, and there's the doctor pops up. Now, I was in this room setting up for about 45 minutes before you all came in with my trusty technician Mark and a backup, which we've already had to use. It's never plug and play. When I did my videoing of the gentleman you'll see later, about 3 or 4 weeks ago, we had all sorts of problems. He forgot his password, we couldn't get in, he ended up doing the FaceTime on my phone rather than his phone and all that kind of thing. So this idea that you just get it out and there's the doctor, it's not so much expectation, I think it's hype actually. Anyway, what they did was they did some mystery shopper work actually. I think I've got another one from the Daily Mail in a couple of slides' time, where they ring up these or they Skype these doctors and find out, what they get told, and then they write about it in the Daily Mail or the Guardian. Conservative Party conference. Jeremy Hunt was there with the Royal College of General Practitioners. Fringe event on digital access. This is one of the top political priorities at the moment. When Tony Blair came up in 1997, it was every patient will have an electronic record that you could access from anywhere in the country. Remember that one? With Jeremy Hunt, it is this remote access at the moment. So it's absolutely hot. Well, I have to say, Stephen asked me to do this lecture about a year ago, I think, when it wasn't hot. But, hey, sometimes it all comes together. There is a bit of a rearguard protest from some doctors that actually what we need is not more of these high-tech solutions, which are a little bit gimmicky. And what they're saying is, hang on a minute, the doctor may not have access to the patient's medical notes, which is true, could miss symptoms that they would spot in person. This is one of the key things we're looking at. Are they going to miss things? And what they really need is to simply put more money for more GPs, more practice nurses, etc., etc. And this idea that, oh, no, hang on, you guys are all laggards, you must embrace the age of the smartphone, as if that's going to improve efficiency. And so this is the argument that's going back and forth. As a scientist, I don't want to take a position on that argument, because you can see I'm quite keen on the technology. It's not that, I'm not a Luddite. On the other hand, I'm not sure that we've got data yet to answer these questions. I hope we will have quite soon. Here's the mystery shopper experience clip in the Daily Mail. Can you really trust a GP who diagnoses you over a webcam? The NHS seems to trust them. And actually in the literature, there's a lot about trust. If you're in the room with the doctor or the nurse, it just seems more real, and people use it seems more real. But in addition, this article from the Daily Mail last week, described some very interesting technical problems where the Skype kept cutting out, and so the doctor then said, well, don't worry if it cuts out again, I'll phone you on an ordinary telephone. What's your phone number? And they finished it all off with an ordinary phone call. even in the ones that are already set up in the private sector, the technical problems have not been ironed out, not by any means. Oh yes, here we are. What's more, our Skype connection keeps cutting out. The GP telephones me. There we are. That's a direct quote from the journalist who's being a mystery shopper on that. All right. What's the evidence? And never mind what are the answers. What are the questions? Come on, 2/3 of you said you were academics. What are the research questions? I know you're not undergraduates, but hey.
Well, I'll start because
Oh, you can have the microphone. I'm not doing roving mic every day.
I mean, one of the key questions is about that relationship between practitioner and the patient or the person who's come to see them, and that is built on a lot more than very remote visual or audio signs. I mean, there's things like touch and things which are also used in diagnosis. So one of the key questions would be, what is that relationship in terms of and I think you use the word trust, but I mean, even that may be too much, but that kind of a building of a relationship, the engagement between practitioner and patient.
Yeah. And actually, the computer scientists have got a word for this. You think computer scientists are those geeks that are only interested in code. Actually, they're really good at studying the human elements of interaction, and they call it presence. To what extent is there presence, with a CE at the end, not TS? And they've got a whole way of theorising and looking at that, which I think is really, really interesting. Who's next?
I think, we're obsessed with looking at service-related outcomes like, does it reduce hospital admissions and all that stuff, and I'm much more interested in, how does the patient perceive the outcomes? What's the outcomes for the patient? So research questions should be about finding about what it is the patient wants from the consultation, but also the whole thing is about, can they maintain their health better themselves with self-management, or is that something that they want to do? Or it's kind of like those sort of patient-centred outcomes, really.
So lots of complex, soft questions, although you also pointed out some important questions about, hang on a minute, does it reduce admissions? What's the cost? All that kind of thing, which are important questions as well, but they're not the totality. Yeah.
I think you're getting ahead of yourself, excuse me, because the big thing is being able to get a reliable contact between the two ends every time without breaks, and you can't do it. I live in a fairly built up area, but the only time I can guarantee to get a contact is if I go out in the garden. I was down in Cornwall last week, and the hotel I was in said, well, you may be able to use a mobile phone, but it's rather sporadic. In fact, it was even more sporadic when I was there. And so unless you can do this, I think you're going ahead of yourself.
And thank you for pointing that out. I think you're absolutely right. There's a great book by Paul Durish and Genevieve Bell called Divining a Digital Future, and the subtitle is something like Mess and Mythology in something or other, in ubiquitous computing, I think. And what their argument is precisely this, that on the one hand, the future, where there's lots of computers all over the place and we do a lot of things digitally, is already here. On the other hand, all the mess is here as well. There's a tangle of wires. I mean, you should have seen Mark when we were kind of putting this together. It was taping down wires, and so that it could look seamless to you, but it isn't seamless. And then we joining it all together. I would say, I don't know the percentage, but in a significant percentage of the consultations that we try to video, something goes wrong technically. And it may be the broadband isn't good enough, it may be the patient's forgotten their password, it may be, you can imagine. But yes, at the moment we're not connected up, are we? And will we ever be? Will we ever be? That's a question, you know, this idea that just around the corner all those technical problems are going to disappear. I'm not sure. I'm going to have one more and then I'm going to go on.
So I think there's sort of quite a lot of evidence questions that have to be asked, you know, which patients, in what context, for what condition, when and how. So I think there are quite a lot of sort of stages actually exploring of how this framework of this particular way of consulting might work.
Again, that is a really, really important point, that the two clips I'm showing you, actually no, one was diabetes, the other guy is also diabetic incidentally, but actually this is a heart failure consultation. And if you look at the literature, these kind of consultations have been tested in a relatively narrow group of studies, a group of conditions. And when I think of some of my relatives with very complex medical problems, but also a bit of cognitive impairment, all the rest of it, would Granny be able to handle this? Probably if we were there with her, and it'd be a jolly sight easier than taking her to outpatients, but on the other hand it would then put a big burden on us. But you're right, there's a massive, massive research agenda, and just because it works for, you know, this young, quite intelligent woman that we've just seen with diabetes and pregnancy doesn't mean it will work for everybody. Okay. Now I'm going to, those are great research questions. I'm going to tell you what our research questions are. And actually, first of all, I'm going to tell you what still hear me? What other people have studied on remote video consulting. So the biggest chunk of work in the literature is technical description. It's those really geeky journals that, you know, where it really is not much more than code and wires and things like that, and saying, look, here is the nerdy bit to get it connected. It can work very well technically, and of course the only ones that get written up are the ones that have worked. But as my colleague over here rightly pointed out, we all know that it actually very often doesn't work. But it can work. There are then, that's just the technical bits can work. And then there are a lot of what I would call show and tell studies. Small, uncontrolled patient series saying that it can work for real. And these are often quite quick and dirty. You know, one clinic, usually in Australia or something like that, so we've done it and it worked and the patients were happy and nothing badly went wrong. And there's a few of them. And then, of course, there are randomised controlled trials, because we're doctors, hey, you know, we do randomised trials. And so you randomise people to the usual care or the video. Quite a lot in chronic disease management, which is the ones I'm showing at the moment. Actually, the diabetes in pregnancy is a relatively short disease, hopefully get better after the baby's born. And also in counselling, psychotherapy, actually. An awful lot of very good studies of cognitive behaviour therapy through video links, that kind of thing. Patients who managed to connect had comparable outcomes to the usual care group. That's a sweeping statement, but broadly speaking, we're not seeing that the doctors or nurses are missing very much. You know, people are pretty happy with it, satisfaction very high. Patients, importantly, say they feel in control. They feel more in control in the remote consultation than they do when they're sitting in the doctor's office. I wonder why that might be. But about half of them, in the studies that have been published, never connected. So you get your money for your RCT, you register the RCT at inception, as all good trialists should. At the end, you count up and you think, oh, crikey, you know, we had 28, but we only actually recorded 14 or something like that. Actually, they didn't record, but so technical problems were very, very high. And some studies had low uptake among staff, and there's a quote. No, I didn't put it in the end, where they say the patients loved it, but we had a bugger of time persuading the nurses to use it, which I think is quite interesting. But then, I know I've been an NHS clinician, and it's pretty busy. This is a clip from a paper that I'm going to show you later. This is just a a protocol paper for the vocal study, actually, and it just describes one example. It's a bit like a review of the literature at the introduction to my paper. Video visits in follow-up after surgery for prostate cancer. 55 men, so these are small samples. That's actually one of the bigger ones, randomised to video follow-up or usual care, and they were assessed as equivalent in efficacy, whatever that meant in prostate cancer land. Amount of time spent face-to-face, patient waiting time, total time devoted to care. So these are quantified outcomes. No significant difference in patient perception of visit confidentiality, efficiency. You can imagine all these tick things that the patients do. And lower patient-borne costs, which is hardly surprising because they don't have to go out the door. But actually, I think not hospital-borne costs, and that's quite important. The economists among you will know that nobody really cares about patient-borne costs. Of course we do, but when you're doing cost-effectiveness analysis, the patient's bus fare is very rarely taken into account. Okay. So here's what I think are the unasked questions in that body of literature, and it's still a fairly sparse literature. The first question I want to know is, where are the negative studies? What we have is a data set, which I've got on file, consisting entirely of small studies, all of which are positive, all of which say this works a treat. It's positive, or that it's as good as usual care, and then something is even better, such as patient-borne costs. I'm interested in the subtle nuances of the consultation, as some of you were. Is the remote encounter as good as a real one? One day it will be real, it's just that we still call the face-to-face encounter real. And if it isn't, what is lost? And how does that matter, if at all? When does it matter? So that's the micro-level questions. I'm also interested, as someone who studies organisations and organisational change, in what I'm calling the meso level. What are the challenges of introducing a completely new way of working, and how can those challenges be overcome? And then I'm also interested in the macro questions at political level, at policy level. Why the push? Why is it smartphone medicine right now? What's that all about? Can we please place that in some kind of path-dependent historical context? Business. I was at Microsoft a couple of weeks ago. I was dining with someone from Apple a couple of weeks before that. It's a hard life being an academic. What are the implications for the technology industry? What's industry's position? Has it changed? That kind of thing. And if so, why? Ethical and legal. We haven't talked about this much, but I mean, before I agreed for my lecture to be recorded, I had to sign a legal disclaimer, I had to get written consent from the patients, all that kind of thing. Similarly, for remote consultations, there's committees, sitting in Whitehall thinking about the legal and ethical issues. And the Medical Protection Society, Medical Defence Union, Royal College of Nursing, they were all thinking about these. What does it mean for professional practice? And then economics. Is this going to do what Jeremy Hunt thinks it's going to do and save money? Is it going to address the staffing crisis? Is the Prime Minister's Challenge Fund on all these technology projects going to sort of disappear, or is it going to slowly take us to somewhere where we will have an affordable, sustainable NHS, despite the increase in chronic diseases? Because none of us are dying, that's the problem, and you know that. All right, so the two studies that I'm presenting you already, actually, are one's called Vocal, Virtual Online Consultations, Advantages and Limitations. Credit, please, to Satya Bhattacharya, my surgeon colleague in the Vocal study, because he thought of that. My acronym wasn't nearly as good. And then SCALS, which stands for Studies in Co-Creating Assisted Living Solutions. And that one's, the Vocal's funded by the NIHR, HS&DR programme. SCALS is funded by a senior investigator award to me from the Wellcome Trust. SCALS is an important thing because the NIHR are really keen. Who's applied for an NIHR grant here? Yeah, loads of you. Okay, so you know what it's like. You have to set out every bit of what you're going to do, work package 1, work package 2, and all the rest of it, and what are you going to produce in the middle of year 3, and how much reagent are you going to use, and all that kind of thing. And it's a bit stultifying, because what you can't say is we're going to suck it and see, and then we're going to follow our nose and see what happens. The Welcome Senior Investigator Awards are great. They fund you on your track record. You go along and say, well, this is what I've done so far, and I've got this vague idea to look at virtual consultations and assisted living solutions, but I don't really know what I'm going to do for the next 5 years. And Welcome said, yeah, okay, you seem a pretty good bet. We'll give you the money for the next 5 years, and just keep us informed once a year of how the research has unfolded and what new twists it's taken. And I would put a plea to research funders that if you want something really creative, you've got to actually back some horses, and some of them are going to, some are going to win, some are not. So thanks to both the NIHR and Wellcome Trust, who are funding things in different ways. All right, so that's Scales and Vocal. So what are they all about? With Vocal, we're looking at 3 hospital-based services in Newham and Mile End and Whitechapel, so all parts of Barts Health. Adult diabetes, young adult diabetes, diabetes antenatal, the one you saw, and cancer follow-ups, like the prostate cancer follow-up, only we're doing actually liver cancer because Sacha is a liver surgeon. And he happens to be married to the diabetologist who was working with me on the diabetes one, so we would bring him in. Yeah, it's all right, we admitted that in the grant. And we're looking at outpatient consults via Skype. We did try Adobe Connect and it didn't work out so well, so we're doing it via, not Skype for Business, but just plain Common Garden Skype that you can all download on your phones. But if you want to download it onto a hospital computer, it takes 3.5 weeks and 15 forms and a sign-off and all that kind of thing. One element of Scales is a big programme of work, it's a big programme grant, is the community-based heart failure service at Oxford. And this is nurse-led, they're heart failure specialist nurses, and I'm going to show you one of those consultations in a minute. So the data sources for both of these studies are videotaped consultations, like the one you just saw, but we're also doing a lot of meso-level analysis, building up organisational case studies, using the usual data sources for, if you don't know what an organisational case study is, it is a rich story of what happened and why and how, using data sources like ethnographic field notes, sort of observe what happens, documents, people's business plans, the minutes of meetings, emails, letters, interviews, and then some quantitative data like waiting times, did not attend rates, and also costs. Can't tell you much about the costs, that's someone else's bit. We're not doing a formal cost effectiveness analysis, but we will get the kind of cost data that will inform someone else to do a study on that. And then we're looking at policy, and we're also interviewing national stakeholders. We've got 2 people from NHS England on our Scales steering group, and we are feeding in to Simon Stevens' team, which is really nice. So it's not just that we're interviewing them for their perspective, but we're also engaging them in order that the study will have impact. Those of you who write ref submissions will know that I'm actually carefully crafting these studies to make sure that we write up an impact case study at the end. All right, so I'm going to show you, give you about half a slide on each of the micro, meso and macro, and then we can have another discussion. So you've already seen one video clip of consultation, and you can see that we have the potential for very detailed analysis of text and body language, and that's ongoing. I'm actually going to see if this will work on this thing, but I don't think it will. No, it's not going to, is it? Oh, it is.
So if that's not working,
And this is
would accept one we did earlier.
This is me overriding the research now. I decide this guy's been through enough, and I say, come on, because I had to take his blood, but I had to do a full clinical examination, because part of the ethics approval, because this stuff hasn't been shown to work, is that an independent evaluation by a clinician should be done as well. So I arrived early and I got that over with, so we already knew his blood pressure. But even so, I decide he's been through enough, and so I say to the nurse, look, come on, just write down the one I did. And fortunately, she said that would be acceptable. Okay, so let me summarise what we're finding in the micro level. And you see, we've got most of the data analysis still to come. As has been shown in previous studies, when the technical connection is successful, the outcomes are usually positive. You know, he was able to show her his ankles and do quite a lot remotely. But the technical connection is not always successful, which is what my colleague pointed out. And there are some things you can't do remotely. For example, if I hadn't been there and been a clinician, there's just nothing she can do with the fact that his blood pressure machine isn't working. Skype consultations we are finding are shorter, but they're not always clinically comparable to what goes on in a face-to-face consultation, because this gentleman will go and see the nurse face-to-face next time, and then she will do the listening to the chest and all the things that you can't yet do remotely. So the fact that the Skype consultations are shorter is partly because there's less in them, but we will be analysing them systematically. I would say, and I don't think I've demonstrated this to you with the little clips today, but the clinical aspects of a person's illness or illnesses very much affect their ability to use the technology and particularly to troubleshoot with the technology. And, you know, as someone who's been quite sick in the last couple of years, I'm better now, when you're having a bad day, you know, you can't do anything. You can't even kind of fix a fuse in the toaster. When you really look at all the patients are nodding. Some days you're doing all right, but when you're ill, you can't do it. And there's an irony there, isn't there? Because what we're talking about is using technology for people who are sick. The fact that the young guy from The Guardian was able to Skype the Babylon doctor and get told that he had a sebaceous cyst on his neck, and that was the example. All right, big deal, but I'm quite interested in you know, older people with complex needs, for example, people with mental health problems, people with, you know, drug and alcohol problems, the sort of people that I see in my GP surgery. So there's a bit of a kind of paradox. I do want to play you this bit. This is a video. We've finished the consultation, the nurse has said goodbye, and this I think I'm filming. Oh no, I'm still filming him on the video, that's right. And I asked him how it went. So this is the patient's evaluation.
Oh, it's already gone.
So how do you think that went?
Brilliantly.
Uh-huh.
I would happily do that with my GP, or chiropody would be a bit difficult.
Yeah, it would if they were cutting your toenails, wouldn't
nails
they?
in the post.
Yeah, that would be a
Yes.
bit difficult. But yeah, you were very comfortable with her?
Very.
Yeah.
Yeah. I suppose partly because I'm quite gregarious and I don't mind who I meet.
But you already know that nurse, don't you?
Well, that's true. I must say though, had I not met her before, I wouldn't have felt uncomfortable with that situation. Him or her watching me breathing, if I can.
Yeah, you were fiddling the phone around, weren't you, so that she could see you breathing?
Yes, and then show me ankles.
And that showing your ankles, that was all right?
Oh gosh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I know what it was for, because if there's going to be any swelling, that's where it'll start.
Yeah.
Certainly with me, and then it would sort of spread up legs and the rest of me. But that's one of the nice things I know every morning, whether I'm putting a slipper on or a sock or whatever.
Yeah.
You can't help but look at your ankles, and for me, it's always a nice little.
Yeah. So you gauge how you were doing.
And a nifty one that I used to use, just because I've had the socks rolled a bit, you do get.
Yeah, you get sock marks, don't you?
But I know when I've had it before and it's been really swollen, they really are, really great big marks that stay there.
Yeah, so you're comfortable assessing that, and actually she could see it quite well,
very
couldn't
much
she?
so, yes.
Yeah.
And also, if I had a finger on for pulse or whatever, that would be easy to.
You could have shown her, that's right.
And
was there anything that you might have done in a face-to-face consultation that you weren't able to do just now?
I can't think of anything. I was thinking about this yesterday to try and sort of gear my head up somewhat as to, whatever. but I'm pretty much of the opinion nothing ever goes wrong. Some stuff needs tweaking or readjusting, or oh well, I'll see you next week then.
Yeah, once we'd overcome the password thing, once we got the technology working, you were very, you looked pretty relaxed.
Yes.
And you behaved yourself very well,
Yes, it has to
Fergus.
be an initial thing
Well
with
done.
him. He's like, you know, oh, yeah.
Yeah, no, he
Are
was.
you interesting? Do you smell nice? And
Of course, he can't smell her over the technology, can he? So he wasn't worried about that.
So
He did,
he'd
didn't
lick
he?
the screen, I'm sure.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much.
You're
That's the
welcome.
thing. We're done. Thank you. When I first arrived to do that consultation, the dog was all over me, wouldn't stop barking, and actually it took a while to calm him down. But then when he got used to the whole thing, then he just, as you saw, he just lay there on the couch. And I think it's rather charming to have this chap with his favourite dog. Okay, do you want to talk about? Let's talk about that for a bit, and then I'll tell you about the meso. Who hasn't yet?
It seems to be saving a lot of time. It's improved for the practitioners.
It didn't seem to be saving a lot of time for the practitioner.
On a cost-effective sort of basis, it seems not. It's taking them even longer.
I think you're right. I think this lady's saying it's taking them even longer. Because how many of us as doctors or nurses have checked a patient's edema? I mean, she did it very thoroughly. I'm not sure that I do both feet and all the way up from, but whatever. But it was quite laborious, wasn't it, to get him to do it, even though he said he did it every day when he put his socks on. It really was quite a fiddle. And the bit I didn't show you was when she was counting his respiratory rate. And he was just holding the phone there. It was technically possible, and as you saw, he was very comfortable with it. He was sitting in his own living room. He was really comfortable there with his dog and everything, but it took a long time. Yeah.
Potentially there's a counter-argument to that though, because actually the amount of patient education that goes on that builds self-efficacy there, if you didn't have that encounter would have enabled that, and then long-term gains are that people do have a much better understanding of their own health, how to manage it, and I think that's the bit. So I can understand the negative perception, but I think there are some very real gains there.
Yes, that's an important point, because that was, I think, was the first time. I'm not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure that was the first time he'd had a heart failure consultation. And although she talked him through it, in a way she was teaching him to do it. And you got the idea of this gentleman, he did pick up on it, and next time he might be a bit quicker. Whereas, of course, if he came to clinic, the nurse would do it every time, and he wouldn't learn those skills. Yeah, who had a hand up here? I can't remember.
Both consultations resemble more a telephone consultation than a face-to-face consultation. And neither of them, the video elements, adds an awful lot to the consultation, I feel.
Well, why do you think they resemble a telephone consultation?
Well, because you're not in the same room with the patient. Most of the examinations that were done could have been done by talking to them. You didn't really need to see it. Certainly with the diabetic lady, but even with this lady, with this man, very little. He could say, she could ask about the socks. Can you have you got sock marks?
This is really interesting. Who agrees? And I don't know. This is a straw poll. Who thinks that the video didn't add very much, and it could have been done on the phone? Interesting. And who thinks the video added subtle stuff that enriched rather more for that? But I put it to you that it's quite hard to nail exactly what the video adds. And that is what we're going to be looking at. I'm going to take one more question from someone who hasn't asked.
It would just seem that if you're going to do that routinely, patients would have a lot of equipment in their home. And although you were there to help when the equipment broke down, that wouldn't happen normally. So there's also a risk, and it might be that patient would then need another appointment because the information wasn't gathered via Skype the first time.
I totally agree, and actually he did have a huge amount of equipment in his home, most of which wasn't working or was, for various sort of other human factors. And yes, I absolutely overrode the difficulties he was having because his clinical care took priority. Because to me, he's a heart failure patient. I'm keeling over from stress, you know. But yeah, it only worked. And yet the guy, I'm amazed. Yeah, it worked perfectly. Nothing's going to go wrong. He's an optimist, isn't he? But actually, that consultation was only possible through a workaround. And one of the things we're studying is workarounds. We're going through every consultation saying, what are the workarounds that allow him to do this, and that allow that keep the show on the road. Some very interesting work from Mark Berg, if you know his work, he's a guy from the Netherlands, on workarounds, articulation, whatever they call it. Okay, we will. You will. Those of you who've still got questions, you can ask them in a minute. Okay, so. Do you know what? I'm more interested in the organisational stuff. I am quite interested in the clinical stuff as a clinician. But actually, where there's a real crater in the literature is systematic analysis and theorisation of what is going on at an organisational level. And some of you may have read my work on diffusion of innovations. We developed a framework about 12 years ago now to look at service level change in organisations, and this is again a gross oversimplification, so don't quote me on this in your academic papers, but broadly speaking, introducing a remote video consultation service is massively disruptive for the organisation. It's very difficult and it requires all sorts of things. I'm not going to read them out, but you can see that if you don't have one of these, the whole house of cards isn't going to, come together. It's I think the bottom is important. Endless muddling through. So the sort of things that we've discovered and are now beginning to sort of theorise in the vocal study include a legacy IT system. It's not the kind of stuff Jeremy Hunt is imagining when he does his interviews. Some computers at Barts Health, which did win Digital Trust of the Year a couple of years ago, are still, said to be running Windows 98. Now, according to my data, there is definitely a manager who says they're running Windows 98, but I'm not going to put that in an academic paper until I've actually seen that computer. But frankly, I wouldn't be surprised. Middle managers had competing priorities. This is basically somebody's pet research study. It's not the top of everyone's agenda. The IT department are seriously overburdened. They say things like, well, we don't support Skype. And we say things like, well, your chief executive's a co-applicant on the grant. And they say, we don't know anything about that grant. We don't support Skype. And it's at that level. It isn't anymore, but it's taken a long time. Tariff. You try getting anything mainstreamed if there's not a tariff for it. In other words, how much do we charge someone? You charge someone for a phone call, it's a certain amount. You charge someone for a face-to-face. There's no national or local tariff. There is now. But again, getting a tariff agreed was really difficult. No definitive guidance on information governance. Many of you will have been there. And of course, new technology creates new opportunities. So, for example, paying huge amounts of money for sign language interpreters to kind of go all over the place. I think it's £120 an hour. Well, it'd be much easier if they did everything by Skype and we had the sign language interpreters here. So, of course, the sign language, or the people who pay for the sign language interpreters are banging on the door saying, come on, we need this tomorrow because we know it's going to save us money. And the IT department is saying, oh, no, we're doing diabetes, we're doing anti-nasal, we're doing cancer, that's it, we're not doing sign language. And then the sign language people are saying, well, look, this is a big priority, and blah-de-blah, discrimination, da-de-da. The CCG agenda. Oh, yeah, this is a good one, the politics. So this is field notes from a meeting. The clinical commissioning group's agenda is actually to shift the activity into primary care because it's cheaper, and then just sort of hire in secondary care when needed. Of course, they can get it from anywhere in the country. They don't, if it's by Skype, they don't have to use the local trust. So the dynamic of where care, how the money flows, potentially, they could actually Skype it in from India, in point of fact. That'd be an interesting one with Brexit, wouldn't it? But of course that puts pressure on the trust, and that played in our favour. Once someone started floating this, they said, well, we'd better be the innovative trust, and actually we might be able to offer Skype consultations all around the country. So you can see how technology becomes an opportunity to do things that you couldn't do before. So this came to me, I think, 2 weeks ago, and it, it doesn't matter if you can't read the detail of it, but I'm not sure I can, but this was the minutes of a meeting where finally everyone got around the table to agree not only that it was going to happen, but how it was going to happen, who was going to do what, and who was going to hand over to whom, and where the budget was going to come from. This level of detail took 2 years in a trust that already was applying for and getting Digital Trust of the Year, where their clinical information officer was already going on the telly saying, we're doing it, it's wonderful, plug and play type thing. We had to write standard operating procedures. My researcher Jo Wharton wrote those. Because NHS England was sitting on our steering group, they got very interested and said, oh, could we take those back? And they appeared actually with NHS England's logo on them. And we said, fine, but could you just give us the email so we can put it in our impact case study? We're really happy that they're using them. But until we went along and did that level of detail, nobody was doing it because there weren't any standard operating procedures. It's that kind of boring, mundane stuff that really grinds it to a halt. And then at the macro level, we've been looking at a lot of things actually. One of them is what I've called the modernist policy discourse. Is new is better, growth is good, technology always benign, always efficient, and is going to drive progress. And yet I've shown you the reality of technology. And in fact, just setting up this lecture was another example. We know what it's like. That's the reality. But the discourse is that it's shiny and glittery. And I love that quote from the pop song. The magic day when super science mingles with the bright stuff of dreams, Anyway, historic central control. This health service is the most centralised, most heavily controlled health service in the world, according to one of my colleagues anyway, knows something about it. And yet there's a growing realisation that localities, the frontline NHS organisations have got to innovate. So actually it's, 10 years ago we were looking, nearly 10 years ago, we were looking at National Programme for IT, when it really was ruthless top-down standardisation. The centre has learnt that really you've got to let the periphery innovate, but they can't quite do that because somehow they've got all this bureaucracy and expectations and CQC inspections and goodness knows what else. And so those tensions are fascinating to unpack. I've been very impressed with the technology industry's what I call the new agility. They want to respond very rapidly to patient need, patient ideas, clinician ideas by producing new technologies. They're very interested in health. Some of them appear to have or claim to have a sort of philanthropic interest in health. They're not too worried about making profit. They make their profits elsewhere, so they say. And they want to develop these health platforms, which are now moving apace. 10 years ago I was saying the technology is clunky. Now some of the technology is fantastic, but they can't do business with the NHS because the NHS doesn't trust them. Because they say, well, hang on a minute, last time we did business with you in the National Programme for IT, you made us sign £500 million contracts and then you took the money and you didn't give us the goods. And the industry is saying, no, we're not like that anymore. We know that, that wasn't a very good way to behave. We are now much more, if you like, moral, etc. Trust us. And the NHS said, we can't trust you because we did, you kind of reneged on it last time. So those are interesting issues. Okay. So what are we doing with theoretical lenses? I'm not going to tell you much about these now because I think if you want the kind of serious, heavy stuff, then invite me during the day, I think. But just to give you an idea, we're interested in not just the macro, the meso and the micro, but how those affect each other. We're using something called phenomenology. of the lived body. What's it really like to be the patient and experience it all, and also the embodied knowledge of professionals, the knowledge in practice, the knowledge that comes from that nurse being able to assess what level of edema that patient has. I mean, she'd be far better than me because there's something in her body. She's done it so much, many more times than I have. We're using socio-technical systems theory, which is something that was developed in the Tavistock Clinic to, basically says, people want to do a good job. If you let them design the way they do their job, you'll probably get something that works. If you impose very rigid systems on them, they're going to become unhappy and leave, and nothing will work, type thing. Computer-supported cooperative work is an interdisciplinary theoretical approach, which is particularly interested in workarounds. So it's a bit of social science, a bit of computer science, a bit of human-computer interaction, a bit of psychology, etc. Structuration theory, a bit more the heavy sociology, which I'm quite into if those of you who read my sociological papers, and actor network theory likewise. So, time for discussion. I'm threatening you with more slides on theory because I've got them if you really want them, but actually I'd rather hear more of what you've got to say, and I hope at least one or two of you have been tweeting. What have we got left for discussion? Got 11 minutes by line.
Okay, thank you, Ju. So, open to the floor after... I already see hands chatting up.
I do think video conferencing will only really work when the patient knows the clinician he's talking to.
You think?
There's an element of trust.
Video conferencing will only really work when the patient knows the clinician that they're talking to. I think what you say has some evidence in the literature. And certainly we have decided that ethically, while we're still really seeing what happens, there's a big sort of thing that we don't want to do any harm with this research. The only people we are entering into this study are people who already know their clinician. But the gentleman whose clip you've just seen said the opposite. I said, you get on well with that nurse, you know that nurse, and he said, oh yes, but I'd be perfectly happy with a new nurse. And I thought that was interesting. But yes, I do also believe that I study continuity of care. I'm a GP and I've known some of my patients for many years, and it's totally different when someone comes in that you know, because you kind of like most of your patients, they're most of the nice people. If you don't know them, you're going up a kind of emotional curve as well as a clinical learning curve, and those curves are going to be much more difficult remotely.
Gentlemen, at the back.
I'm just interested in the satisfaction side of things, because you were saying that there's not much evidence of difference between outcomes between face-to-face and video and remote video stuff. That chap was really quite enthusiastic and satisfied with the consultation, where several things went wrong. I just wonder how satisfied, not even been unsatisfied, but would he have been equally satisfied if that had been face-to-face in my surgery and whether he just go up to right, that's a normal sort of consultation. And I wonder, when I say just the satisfaction matter, I don't mean...
But you mean is the measure of it valid?
Yeah.
Is the measure of the patient satisfaction valid? And there's a broader question. Is any measure of patient satisfaction valid? I mean, 2 days ago, I was just being discharged from hospital, and they bring one of these questionnaires, so I tick all the boxes and gave everyone 5 out of 5. I said to the nurse, I've given you all 5 out of 5, you were great. And then just as I was handing it in, I thought, hang on a minute. No, let's do that again, because somebody actually might change something. So I then said, well, breakfast didn't come till 9:15, and I was starving and I had a headache. And the tap in the room is dripping and it needs a plumber. And I then came out with a few things. I was trying to give them feedback, but that was mainly because my taxi was late and I was sitting there, what can I do? Initially, I just ticked all the boxes saying everything was perfect, because I was so pleased to get out. And I think actually the literature on patient satisfaction would suggest, particularly the elderly, particularly people who can remember when we didn't have an NHS, they'll rate everything high, and that it's a bit of a blunt instrument, and often it's not responsive to change. That's the point. You change something, so you're not getting a difference.
Just a number of really interesting points. One of the things I liked about that Skype consultation with the gentleman who was looking at heart failure was that the nurse was able to ask.
Hang on, let me give you this.
The last video consultation where the nurse had asked the gentleman to have a look at his ankles, because I work as a neuroclinician, so encouraging someone to take responsibility or increase their awareness of their own physical, parameters. So the swelling on his leg. So often as clinicians we will test that ourselves, but it's kind of nice that actually to ask someone to bring their own awareness to do that, and he could do that, and he did that, and he used the FaceTime to do that, and I really like that because it's it does add into the lady's point who was talking about education, so educating the individual, encouraging them to take responsibility, and I really like that because I wondered about would it add or would it not, and I actually see that as a real positive. Because that person will then know, I can check the swelling of my ankle and that relates to my cardiac function. So that was quite interesting for me, and I really like that.
Yeah.
Chris.
I think there is, and actually I don't think I'd thought very much about this before I came and talked to you people, but I hear what you're saying, that there is the patient is playing a different role. And if you could express it negatively by saying patient's got more of a workload, or you could express it positively by saying actually the patient's got a bit of a learning curve. But in fact, many of the patients are going to be really pleased about that. That they're going to. I know I did some work in dialysis units a few years ago, where they were introducing this idea that the patient comes in for dialysis, every few days for years. Let's get them to do more of the things themselves, and actually you feel less like you're in a sausage factory, don't you? And so there's all that agenda. On the other hand, there may well be a downside for people who just don't feel well enough to take that responsibility. And we've actually published on this before.
I'll take a couple of questions at a time. So Chris, and then there's a lady on the
With a lot of...
Thanks. With a lot of technology, particularly with things like alerting systems, when you introduce informatics, people become enormously risk averse. Do you see that in your remote consultation? I mean, you mentioned it with the mystery shopper, where they just said, well, you better just go and see your GP and have some tests. Is that something you see more frequently with a remote consultation?
Let me answer that actually. No, but that is because we are filtering these patients like there's no tomorrow. The only ones we're allowing, if you like, to enter this study are the people that the clinician feels 100% confident are safe. And for example, out of 500 patients in the diabetes antenatal on the clinic list, we maybe talk to 20 or 30, of which about half have said, yeah, all right, we can do some video. So it's a tiny proportion of the patients, and we are not claiming they are typical. Now, we're comfortable with that because we can see that these patients are safe. That guy with heart failure, we didn't have very bad heart failure on that day, did he? I mean, that's the sort of thing that, because the nurse had saw him the previous week and thought, yeah, you'll be all right for a video consultation. Our patient advisory group, so we've got a group of patients who come together to look at what we're doing, are horrified by this. They say the patient should choose whether they have the video consultation. And we say, yeah, but the ethics committee have said that it's the clinician's judgment, and the patients are saying, well, that's not fair. It's discriminating against whoever it, blah, blah, blah. But actually we've dug our heels in because we said, well, look, we can't do anything about it. We can't do the research at all if we don't obey the ethics. But I think when it starts rolling out after the research is done, we're going to get exactly the problem that you're alluding to. So, yeah.
Thank you. I think it's very interesting and positive that the patient appeared to take more control in the remote consultation. But my question is whether you've been able to assess whether a patient is more or less likely to seek and attend a remote consultation. Because I can see on the one hand, you might go, fantastic, this is really convenient, I don't need to get all the way to the doctor. But on the other, there might be a sense of intimidated by the technology or slight unpleasant experience.
They sign up, they're there. They get attendance is much higher. We've shown this in the diabetic. In fact, I've just signed off a paper to actually go for publication. The patients are much more likely to attend. Sometimes they forget, but actually not very often. And usually they're around at home. It's just that they, wandered off, and then you try them 20 minutes later. I think the attendance is about 90%, whereas the attendance in the young adult diabetic clinic face to face was 50%, which was why we set up the study in there. So they're very key. But again, some patients say they don't want it. So whatever.
Yeah.
I'm going to pass this back. Pass it back.
I think I was just wondering really, the patient satisfaction with the gentleman at the end, he seemed very okay, very accepting despite some of the disruptions he had with the technology. But had he been given, or had there been an instance where there was something unexpected that occurred with him medically? I wonder just how satisfied he would have been then at that point. And of course, I know with your research, of course you're finding people that you're checking yourself and you're there. But that again is obviously a huge unknown, really.
Well, yes, but then the Skype option doesn't exist in isolation. What you've got here is he's a registered clinic patient. He's on the list, and if a blood result comes in and it says, "Oh goodness me, your PSA is 100, and we better tell you might have prostate cancer," he's not. The nurse probably isn't going to, or the doctor isn't going to just Skype them. They will probably phone them up and say, "Actually, the doctor's changed her mind. She'd like to see you in clinic." Or something, so that and there is a lot of that, not a lot, but there's some examples of that going on. It's not just this is Skype or nothing. That's the problem with the commercial options. But then the commercial options, so often they follow a great long algorithm, and they say we better go to see a GP tomorrow. Well, that's going to save them money, is it?
I haven't usually cared to our speaker, who's been on her feet for a long time, so I'm just going to take one last question. So apologies. So. Just one last question here, and then I think we should let Trish sit down at least.
Thank you. It's just a question really about sort of e-inclusion, and clearly what you've got here are people who are used to, Skype and potentially smartphones. We were talking about people with long-term conditions, elderly people, and often there's a lot of support needed to enable people to access that technology. So I'm wondering if you've got any insights into how we enable the vast population to be able to access that technology.
I don't think there's anything magic, but one of the things that we've found in Newham, where 63% of borough residents were born outside the borough, I think that's right. It's a huge amount. This is a borough where people have been living there for 40 years, but they were actually born in India, Bangladesh, actually some of them have been born in East Pakistan, but now Bangladesh, etc. They are in general very poor, deprived, very multi-ethnic, etc., often living in rented accommodation, but they have one of the highest internet connection rates in the country. Why? Because they're Skyping their relatives back in Bangladesh, in Africa, etc. And we interviewed for a previous study a lady, an 85-year-old Polish refugee, and she was running a website for Polish soldiers. If you know my work on Athene, we called her Magda. And there's the most amazing description of this woman who's incredibly IT literate at the age of 85, but quite disabled. And actually, I think in a way we were lucky that what we had was an immigrant population
who had their own reasons for being able to use Skype or long distance phone calls or phones or whatever. I was up in Accrington not long ago, and I'm not sure that the working class white population of Accrington would be as digitally included. In fact, I know not. But no magic solutions. But it is creeping up. It is, and paradoxically, it's not necessarily the most deprived groups, and it's not the limited English speakers that have also got the lowest IT literacy. It doesn't kind of map to that.
Thank you, Trish. I mean, and as one of the people who actually my phone will not download Skype, or I can ring on it, I can text on it, but I certainly don't ever use it for consultations and things. So perhaps I'm one of the people that maybe technology needs to catch up with. Absolutely wonderful. A very entertaining, very informative talk by Tricia, and I do appreciate, because you have come under fairly strange circumstances, so we really do appreciate.
Yeah, I'm actually going to go and sleep in the car on the way back now.
Well, 100% Fraser hasn't had too many pints in the pub.
He won't have been drinking in the pub at all, because he's my chauffeur.
So, please, if you could bring your hands together and thank you very much.